Attention all personnel! Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. It's time again to revisit one of my favorite franchises, MASH. This time it's in the form of the second novel in the MASH Goes To series, which if you haven't watched last year's video, you should go check it out, but I'll give you a brief explanation here. Before Richard Hooker wrote the second direct sequel, MASH Mania, William E. Butterworth ghostwrote several lighthearted, broadly comedic sequels to the first two books, featuring pastiches of notable pop culture figures and screwing with the continuity of the books by mashing together, pun absolutely intended, bits of character development from both the film and the television series in addition to the books. The first one, MASH Goes to New Orleans, was shaky but otherwise a decent read, and it had a lot of fun comedy in it, in addition to giving much needed development to characters who lacked it in the original novel, most notably Margaret Houlihan and Father Mulcahy, rightfully cribbing development and personality traits from the show. It also introduced Horsey Chavot, a former patient and now friend of Hawkeye and Trapper's, who embroils them in tons of fun at a medical conference in the Big Easy. I wish I could say the same about the following novel, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Today's book details the former army doctors being called into action by the US government once again, and getting a trip to Paris in return. It's MASH, and I don't think I need a long and extremely long-winded prologue to explain anything to you. The show ran for 11 seasons, and is one of the most famous television series to ever exist. If you need a backstory for the first two books, Google it. Also, and this was totally unintentional because I had this book on the schedule months ago, but the Korean War might actually be coming to a real end this year, so weird bit of synergy there. Anyway, let's get this review started. This is MASH Goes to Paris. The cover is, it's pretty identical to the last book, save for a few marked changes. Father Mulcahy is absent, having been replaced by... I don't actually know what the hell that guy is supposed to be, and my question to the internet went unanswered. The two guys in olive drab are obviously Hawkeye and Trapper, and the nurse is supposed to be Margaret, but I'm at a loss for who the third guy is. I guess, based on the way his mouth is open, he could be meant to be Boris Korsky-Rimsakov, who is an opera singer, but I don't think so. He looks like some sort of Russian, though. Maybe they mixed up the cover with the one for MASH Goes to Moscow, and that one has a mime on it? Guess we'll find out when we get to that one. Otherwise, the cover design is pretty solid. Not bad, and I like the little centralized design with the Eiffel Tower in the background. Though the windows on the Jeep are dirty, so I can't tell which side of the road they're driving on, but either way, neither person in the front is looking at the road. And Margaret should know better than to cross the street in front of those lunatics, especially not looking confused and about to fall over. Except for not knowing who the man in red is, I actually really like this cover. Let's get to the story itself. Our story starts when Horsey Chavot is due to be invited to Paris to be awarded with a special medal, due to him graciously paying to repair a French statue in New Orleans that he probably damaged in the first place. Additionally, Margaret Houlihan and a Midwestern fast food executive are also being honored, the executive going by the name J. Robespierre O'Reilly. We'll get back to him later. The thing about Horsey, if you saw the last MASH review, is that he's rowdy as all hell, and the US government wants to avoid an international incident. His official file has only 3 people listed that can keep Horsey in line. The Archbishop of Swampmen, who is otherwise disposed on Vatican business at the moment, and 2 doctors currently living in Maine. Their former commanding officer, Major General Henry Blake, is called to meet with the Secretary of State because they want to get intel on Hawkeye and Trapper and want to send Henry along to keep them in line, though Henry pleads with them to check up on the Archbishop one more time before deciding. The U.S. government is also dealing with, and I hate that these words have to come out of my mouth, but militant feminist Congresswoman Hortense V. Klump. And oh dear Lord, is her character super uncomfortable. She is the dictionary definition of feminazi, and I use that word in quotes, by the way. And I'll tell you this right now, her entire character arc was boring and played out in the 70s when this book was written. Based on her attitude, I'm pretty sure you'll figure out where that arc is going to. Air Force One lands in Spruce Harbor to pick up the duo, with Wrongway Napolitano, their flight controller/pilot, at first not believing the radio that Air Force One is landing in Spruce Harbor. Lo and behold, it does, and then they go all the way through Wrongway to the police chief and the mayor, an old friend of Hawkeye's, and the duo is called up, Hawkeye having been indisposed because he was taking care of an old teacher. They give him the news, and his teacher tells him to go check out the plane. He and Trapper meet up at the airport and are surprised to see their old CO step off the plane. Henry tells them that their country needs them, and while they naturally decline, fool them once, shame on you, fool them twice, shame on them, the Undersecretary Copperwaith informs Hawkeye and Trapper that the U.S. government
invoked a little-known, seldom-used reserve activation clause.
In simpler words, they drafted them. Again. In truth, according to the Secretary, they were never actually discharged properly, and knowing the Army, that makes sense. At first, they're not enthused, but a promise of medals and a look at the guest list, including Robespierre O'Reilly, who they expertly deduce immediately is Radar, gets them to agree. More importantly, them being home all the time is annoying the crap out of their wives, so they're going regardless of what the government says. Hawkeye's only stipulation is that they stick around for 1 day, long enough to perform surgery on his teacher, and then they can move out. They pick up Mr. O'Reilly, who is thrilled to see his old army buddies, and we get another origin story that doesn't entirely mesh with the canon of either the movie or the show. We learn that Radar's psychic abilities, his ability to predict what Colonel Blake wanted before he wanted it, were discovered while Hawkeye and Trapper were at the 4077, despite his abilities having been shown in the first pages of the book, before either of them showed up. Furthermore, despite the story mentioning a poker game with the Painless Pole, Hawktrap, and Henry, we get no mention of Duke Forrest, an integral part of their group. At least the last book admitted that Duke existed instead of just writing him out. Radar, when his abilities first manifested, used his abilities to cheat at poker and take all the others for all they had, but eventually the doctors got wise, and they realized that his abilities were dampened by sexy pinups, so they post them all over the walls and they win back all their stuff, forcing Radar to admit his powers and promise to only use them for good. Which he did, using it to form his fast food empire, since when he was working as a dishwasher at a truck stop once he got discharged, he found out that all the truckers really wanted was Irish stew like their moms used to make, and Radar gave the people what they wanted. They also pick up Christina Korsky-Rimsakov, famous opera singer and sister to Luciano Pavarotti pastiche Boris Korsky-Rimsakov, who are going to perform together in Paris when she arrives. She gets on and hits it off with Radar, but unfortunately Congresswoman Klump shows up and boards the plane, intent on getting a medal in Paris too, because feminism? To be completely honest, I don't know what her deal is. She hates men, and I guess she thinks that too many men are being honored or something. Never mind that she hasn't actually done anything to merit an honor, but whatever. Finally, they pick up Margaret, Horsey, and Horsey's entourage in New Orleans. After she leaves, Margaret's new suitor, Colonel Bocomo, intent on protecting his lady love, sends Ace Travers to Paris to keep an eye on her, and Ace leaves without telling his wife Prudence. Meanwhile, in Paris, Boris is eagerly awaiting his sister's arrival and is waiting at a bar with Prince Hassan, a friend of his from a fictional but obviously meant to be vaguely Arab country. He's stressed because his his sister doesn't know that he lives a life of debauchery in Paris. They end up being almost late for the plane, and during the landing, Horsey's friends from the Knights of Columbus cause a ruckus, which causes Prince Hassan's group to get into a huge fight with them, leading the authorities to think that there's some manner of terrorist activity going on. Because Hassan is an Arab, and my research online told me that that's the proper word to use to refer to people from that part of the world, but if it's not, please correct me in the comments. In between all of that, when Boris tries to rush onto the plane to save Christina, Congresswoman Klump headbutts him in the stomach, incapacitating him. When the smoke clears, the crew is released into Paris, and everyone has their own stories to follow. Henry has to keep everything calm, Hawkeye and Trapper attempt to treat Boris, who hates doctors, Radar tries to get with Christina and make her Mrs. O'Reilly, Horsey's entourage runs around causing trouble in Paris, Congresswoman Klump gets in touch with her feminine side, and Ace Travers tries to find Margaret to fulfill his mission for the Colonel. Over the course of the book, the storylines converge and diverge a lot. Radar and Christina go out on a date and get together. Hawkeye and Trapper keep an eye on Boris because Hassan and Christina think she needs medical attention, and they need to find a way to knock him out since he won't cooperate while awake, and they plan to use roofied alcohol to do the job. Klump gets catcalled while walking down the street in Paris, finds that she actually really likes it, and with the help of her assistant, Mary Margaret, gets in touch with her feminine side. Standard for one-dimensional militant feminist characters, really. The Colonel, not satisfied with just sending Ace to Paris, gets on a plane himself and tries to chase down Margaret. The next morning, Ace Travers wakes up in bed after getting drunk with a beautiful woman, and when he realizes that, he rushes down and tells Prince Hassan that he's a married man and needs that woman gone. Hassan agrees to help and sends a few of his men to abduct the woman and leave her outside the U.S. Embassy. The woman, understandably shaken, goes inside the embassy and tells them her whole story. Her name is Prudence MacDonald, and she was sleeping next to her husband, Ace Travers, when she was suddenly abducted by a group of Arabs, furthering the reports of terrorist activity. Hassan, wanting to get Boris laid after the show, sends a prostitute to his dressing room, but she drinks the spiked champagne and falls unconscious. When Hawkeye and Trapper carry her out, Hortense V. Klump wanders into the dressing room, and Boris shows up, and you can guess what happens next. At least that's what they want to happen. Having seen the show and remembering Boris from the plane, Klump realizes that she loves Boris, and they're about to make passionate love when they also partake in the spiked alcohol, and when Hawkeye and Trapper get back, they find the two unconscious on the floor. The Colonel catches up with Margaret, and they, the Undersecretary, Christina, and Radar, go out for a night on the town. Before they leave, Christina asks Radar to go make sure that Hawkeye and Trapper handled Boris, and he finds the empty dressing room, taking the unattended alcohol for himself, which he then gives to Margaret, the Colonel, and Copperwaith, and predictably, they pass out. The next morning, Radar and Christina go to check on Boris, finding out that the examination went well, and Boris is mostly healthy, apart from singer's nodes, which are growths on his vocal cords, which for a singer are pretty detrimental to his career. Boris thinks that because he's in a hospital, he's gonna die, which Radar confirms by reading his mind, accidentally sharing his power with Christina. They explain to him that he's healthy, and he immediately begins worrying about finding the woman from last night again. Thankfully, Hawkeye and Trapper brought her along too, everyone being surprised at her identity. Klump, willing to do anything for her newly beloved Boris, agrees to do Hawkeye and Trapper a favor on behalf of Copperwaith, who is being blamed for all the shenanigans that have happened in Paris since their arrival, saving his job. While explaining the procedure, both Boris and Klump pass out, and the surgery is performed post-haste. The novel ends with everything working out. Boris is saved, Radar has a girlfriend, Klump is gonna marry the love of her life, Ace and Prudence are reunited, and everyone gets a medal for their troubles. The characters we saw in the last book, namely Hawkeye, Trapper, Margaret, and Horsey, are written very well, and act like they did in the last book, though Margaret is sort of wasted in this one, and only gets one really memorable scene when Congresswoman Klump tries to get into the restaurant that she spies Henry, Hawkeye, and Trapper eating in, with what looks like some blonde floozy. She angrily approaches them and comments on her, only to find out that the floozy is none other than Reverend Mother Margaret Houlihan, which is just glorious. The stuff with the Colonel chasing her was honestly sort of meh, and didn't really have a great payoff. I did, however, like Hawkeye and Trapper's storyline. It was all shenanigans all the time, which is frankly how these versions of the characters are suited. They did mostly drinking, scheming to get Boris into a hospital, and actual medical stuff, which again is what those versions of the characters are suited for. I would have preferred more actual character stuff, but these guys are sort of one note because we got all their nice character stuff in the first book because they were the main focus. It was an absolute joy to see Radar and Henry again, especially Henry because, and spoilers for the 43-year-old episode, because I know someone would get mad at me for spoiling it, the version on the television series had his plane shot down over the Sea of Japan. It spun in. There were no survivors. So getting to see Henry again was great, as was the fact that due to the nature of these books, he acts more like McLean Stevenson than he should. I also like how they drafted Henry into assisting with the surgery in Crabapple Cove, which reminded me of how they got out of trouble back in the pilot episode of the television series. Although, Henry disappears at one point, and I don't know if maybe I missed a line of dialogue or something, and the lack of an ebook that I can do a keyword search in has made it complicated, but I don't even think he's mentioned after he disappears. I admit, I might have missed a line that writes him out, but even then, that's a huge disappointment. I did like what they did with Radar, though I'm not in love with his new origin story. Radar's joke on the show was how utterly clueless he was with women, so seeing him finally get the girl is great, though the sheepish nature was not present in the original book, so its inclusion here is troubling. He was conniving and not above drinking and smoking in the source material, yet in the show he eventually settled into being the choir boy Sam Beckett type character of the outfit. They develop his relationship with Christina, his fast food empire, and everything else fairly well, so the glaring continuity errors don't bother me as much as they probably should. Sure, Radar's psychic abilities were more overt on the show, and in the books it was just a really good sense of hearing, and the book/films Radar didn't have the sheepishness around women, but the backstory doesn't matter much because they made him a likable character in the present, which they succeeded in doing, and unlike my problems with Father Mulcahy's backstory, we never really got an explanation for Radar stuff in the first book, so it's not completely ruining a moment from the first book. If you remember, the Father Mulcahy thing was that they deliberately rewrote a scene from the first book to take place during the show. Hortense v. Klump is a nightmare. So, if you only know MASH from the television series, you might be confused at how these books seem to be, in lack of a better term, super-duper conservative, as opposed to the anti-war liberal sensibilities that the show had. That's not an accident. The producers of the show, and likely Alan Alda himself, since he had a huge part in the show's writing in the later years, veered very heavily from the roots of the novel and the Hooker's own beliefs, Hooker being a conservative until his death. One thing that I remember reading in Alan Alda's memoir, Never Have Your Dog Stuffed, was how when the show started, Major Houlihan was known as Hot Lips. She's almost never referred to as Margaret in the book or film, apart from her scenes with Frank Burns. Consequently, when the show ended, her character's name was firmly Margaret, and more importantly, she wasn't the one-joke character that she was in the book. I bring that up because seeing this crazy, man-hating, strawman, feminist, one-joke character is infuriating to me because, one, it's 2018 and those types of characters are boring, and two, it's not what I've come to expect from MASH. Sure, they kept the elements of Margaret giving her agency and sexuality and making her suitor the bumbling idiot and her a capable nurse, but then they go ahead and give us Klump. I don't even want to talk about her because of how crap her character is, but I just can't let it go. Her entire character arc is one-dimensional. She hates men and is a radical women's rights, bra-burning feminist type that I don't think actually ever existed in real life, and once she figures out that she's attractive to men, and that she likes the attention, she immediately changes her entire appearance to go attract a man. I know I'm a straight white dude and I have no frame of reference for any of this, but I just can't not comment on it. And disregarding how blatantly offensive that portrayal is, it's predictable, stock, and boring. On the other side, Boris is a very interesting character, and while I have no knowledge of the personality of Luciano Pavarotti, his behavior in the book reminded me of a different Mr. Pavarotti.
I am not Mr. Pavarotti. Mr. Pavarotti is an Italian. He speaks like this. Do I speak like this? No. Why? Because I am an Englishman, you blistering idiot!
And I guess that I like that he gets a happy ending with Clump, though I dislike her character. He's written to be stubborn, and that definitely comes across, and I do like that he ultimately has a good relationship with his sister and Prince Hassan. Speaking of them, apart from the uncomfortableness of the Arab stereotypes, Hassan was a pretty neat character, and he showed loyalty to Boris by helping Ace just because he found a strange woman in his bed. Christina is also a great character and a nice counterpoint to Clump in that she's just a sweet woman who likes radar. I did also like Ace and Prudence's story, partly because of the comedy and the misunderstanding, but mainly because Ace's mortification that he might have cheated on his wife is reminiscent of B.J. Honeycutt, Master of Fidelity. One huge disappointment is that we don't even get to see Spearchucker, Duke, or any of the non-TV show characters from the first two books, apart from those introduced in the previous one. Which is a shame, because honestly, I like Duke Forrest, and seeing him pushed to the wayside, ostensibly so the books can cash in on the show's popularity, isn't cool. To start off, the pacing is really bad. Sometimes it's slow, and sometimes things happen way too fast. The entire climax is much too fast, and the epilogue is much too slow. We meander through getting everyone together, not landing in Paris until chapter 10, nearly 100 pages in. And that only leaves another 100 for shenanigans in Paris. We don't even get to actually see the real medal ceremony. We only hear about it in an article. I also think that it's a problem with this, and to a lesser extent the previous book, is that there's way too many running threads going through it at once. In the last one, it was sort of compressed, with Hawkeye, Trapper, Father Mulcahy, Horsey, Margaret, and Frank Burns, along with Ace and Prudence, but this one is even more crazy. We have all of those people except Ferretface and Mulcahy, but we add in Boris, Christina, Radar, Copperwave, Henry, Bokomo, Hassan, Horsey's buddies, and Clump. That's way too many people. The strength of the original book was that while it was a story of the camp, it followed Hawkeye and Duke the most intently. At least one of them was present in every major arc. Not so here. I didn't even know what was going on half the time because it kept switching between everyone in different locations. I barely mentioned a few of the subplots because if I went over this with a fine-toothed comb, we'd be here all day. I also think that the entire justification for them going to Paris was weak. At least in the last book it was a medical conference and Hawkeye's wife had a decent, if not understandable reason to want to get rid of him for a few days. Here it's just like Horsey is being honored, so send along all his friends. It's like Horsey's Adam Sandler and only did this to get his friends a free vacation. Which, actually knowing Horsey makes a hell of a lot of sense. And a lot of the action is just boring. I have never had to struggle reading a MASH book until this one, but the incessant hopping around and not sticking to a single story for more than a page or two made it feel like a chore to finish. Nothing that happened in the books was really all that exciting. I mean, in the last book we had the fun suspense of waiting for the other shoe to drop with Frank's wife, the anticipation of Mulcahy's surgery. This one doesn't have anything that really kept me on the edge of my seat. The most urgency we get is that scene when Prudence is kidnapped by Hassan's friends, but once we find out it's Prudence, and that she's safe, it deflates. It wants to give us urgency with Bokomo's near misses with finding Margaret, because we know she's safe and okay, so I'm not invested in it. It feels like, I want to say filler, but I can't understand why they would need filler for an entire book. Mash Goes to Paris is not a great book. Apart from the vaguely racist stuff and rampant sexism, the story isn't all that good, confusing, and not even the novelty of having Henry Blake and Radar back can make this book worth it. It's not a travesty of literature, but it's not a good book by any stretch. It's mediocre at best, and I hate saying that because, well, it's MASH, and MASH is my favorite thing ever. but I've got to call it like I see it. It was a delight to get Radar and Henry back, don't get me wrong, but I wish that instead of introducing new characters and overloading it with random characters, we got a true reunion, bringing back Frank and Mulcahy for this one. The fact that this book doesn't have any sense of urgency and feels like a casual jaunt to Paris for the novelty of making French jokes, and little substance beyond a few good character moments, I cannot in good faith recommend this book, even for a fan of the series. Even if you liked MASH Goes to New Orleans, skip this one. I know I wish I had. There are 10 books left, and this one does not bode well for the rest of them. Any goodwill I had from New Orleans has been sapped. The next one better be good, or I might have to utter the words, "I hate this MASH book," which would just break my heart. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of the Literary Lair, and hit that bell icon to be notified of new uploads, because apparently YouTube can't manage to run a subscriptions page correctly. Be sure to check out my other videos for more reviews like this one, and if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this video, share it to your friends and share it around the internet, and maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. Next week is finals week, so I've got to take the week off to study. But the week after is Towel Day, where I'm going to be revisiting a Douglas Adams series that I haven't really touched on since 2013. See you next time. You know, I don't know if I commented on this in the last MASH video, but the back cover of the book says that MASH is a wacky, fun-filled TV series. Do you want to know what MASH episode first aired the month that this book was released? The one where Robert Alda guest stars as an alcoholic surgeon who gets too drunk to perform a crucial procedure, and then Hawkeye bitches him out for it. A wacky, fun-filled TV series indeed.